Ukraine has already managed to cause serious damage to Russia with its long-range drone strikes. Oil refineries have been a key target, with Russia now dealing with gasoline shortages thanks to 40% of its refining capacity being taken offline over the past couple of months. But it's about to get worse. Much worse. Russia was already having a hard enough time dealing with Ukraine's drones. Now a new weapon has taken flight. Ukraine just unleashed the Flamingo missile, and Russia was powerless to stop it. We got our first hints that Flamingo has evolved from a concept into a combat-ready and usable weapon from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. October 6th saw the Kyiv Post suggest that Ukraine hasn't just been using drones to conduct its recent long-range strikes against Russia. Missiles are in the mix too, Zelenskyy says, which is the strongest hint we have yet that Ukraine's Flamingo missiles are flying into Russia as we speak. RBC Ukraine offers more, noting that Zelenskyy dropped his hints during a joint press conference with Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof. Referring to a recent string of videos shared on social media, you can almost imagine Zelenskyy offering a wink and a nod to the gathered journalists in Kyiv as he said, "Based on those hits, I think people can understand from the fragments on social media where drones are being used and where they are not." That last part of the quote is the important bit. Even a brief mention of strikes inside Russia is practically confirmation that Ukraine is using its missiles for its long-range strikes. What else does it have that could do a similar job? Western-made missiles such as the ATACMS have been quietly blocked by the Pentagon, the Wall Street Journal reported in August. It's possible this block, which required Ukraine to go through an approval process ending with a yay or a nay from US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, may have been lifted. But even if it has, Ukraine can't hit much more than the border regions of Russia with its Western-made missiles. They simply don't have the range. The Flamingo does. However, Zelenskyy declined to say anything more after dropping his hint. No operational details were provided, which means we don't know for certain when or where Flamingo has taken flight. There is one possible strike to cover, so keep watching to find out what that is. Zelenskyy at least had a good reason for offering no more than a hint. Ukraine doesn't want to give Russia any chance to prepare for Ukraine's tactics, no matter what those tactics might be. If the Flamingo is being used, Ukraine wants to ensure Russia can't come up with a countermeasure, such as deploying air defense systems to the sort of targets Ukraine reveals it struck. Ukraine has clearly learned from its past mistakes. Back in 2023, Ukraine spent several months hyping up a counter-offensive that was supposed to break Russia's lines and allow Ukraine to retake the bulk of its occupied territory. The combination of time between planning and execution, and the fact that Ukraine was so open with what it intended to do, gave Russia a chance to prepare layered defenses that pulled Ukraine into a quagmire. Some progress was made. However, Ukraine didn't make anywhere near the game-changing advances that it wanted to make. A harsh lesson was learned in 2023. Ukraine cannot let Russia get a sniff of what it intends to do. We did get a few numbers from Zelenskyy during the press conference, the Kyiv Post adds. Zelenskyy reiterated a past claim that around 60% of Ukraine's deep strikes on Russian territory are being conducted by unmanned systems, some of which can travel over 930 miles to reach their targets. That leaves 40% of strikes unaccounted for. Yet more fuel for the Flamingo usage fire. Building on the hints Zelenskyy dropped, the Kyiv Post also reached out to the Ukrainian General Staff to ask if they could confirm any reports of Flamingo missiles being used against Russia. The outlet didn't get the answer it was looking for. "No, we do not have such information at this time," the General Staff said. It does have the information, but like Zelenskyy, Ukraine's General Staff is taking no risks when it comes to revealing information that Russia could use against Ukraine. Loose lips sink ships, as the idiom goes, and flapping gums could thwart the Flamingo in flight. Still, there's enough of a hint in Zelenskyy's words to tell us that the Flamingo is active, and we might just know one place where Ukraine's powerful new missile has made an impact. In an October 5th report, The Economist claimed that there are believable reports the Flamingo has been used, possibly against Russia's oil refineries. In an article discussing the impact of 2 months of constant long-range strikes against Russia's refining capacity, the outlet said, "There are also reports that FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles have begun to be used. They are much faster than the drones, flying just 50 meters above the ground, with a range of over 3,000 kilometers and packing a huge punch thanks to a 1,150 kilogram warhead. That's over a ton of firepower, by the way, which showcases just how devastating the Flamingo would be when it hits its target. However, The Economist doesn't mention a specific refinery strike. It just confirms that the Flamingo is in use. Details of a more specific strike actually come from an August Militani report. And for this strike, which may well have been Ukraine's first using the Flamingo, it wasn't a refinery that ended up in Ukraine's crosshairs. It was Crimea. The outlet says that a series of strikes conducted against patrol boats and an FSS outpost on the occupied peninsula weren't conducted using Neptune missiles, as initially believed. Instead, Ukraine had deployed Flamingo missiles in what Military dubs a triple launch from the Ukrainian coast on August 30th. Those missiles lifted off one after another, using solid-fueled boosters to do so, before they careened toward their targets. Satellite images of the FSS outpost before and after Ukraine's strike also seem to confirm that Ukraine used a weapon that hits a lot harder than its Neptune missiles. Though the low resolution of the images means that the full extent of the damage can't be determined, what can be seen is that the outpost's main building has been decimated. There is also fire damage evident in the surrounding area, suggesting an explosion that the Neptune and Ukraine's drones can't create. We have to stress that none of this is confirmed at this point. Ukraine certainly isn't going to tell us if it has used Flamingo missiles to strike Crimea or any of Russia's oil refineries. However, circumstantial evidence is starting to build. Footage and photographs of the aftermath of strikes that hint at the use of a more powerful weapon than any Ukraine has deployed previously are making the rounds, and with Zelenskyy's hints regarding the social media footage and Ukraine only using unmanned systems in 60% of its strikes against Russia also being put out there seems to be only one conclusion: Flamingo is active, and it's hitting Russia hard. That brings us to what we know about Flamingo so far. As with the strikes themselves, Ukraine hasn't revealed a huge amount about the inner workings of its new missile. However, several sources have compiled information based on Flamingo showcases at exhibitions and claims from Ukrainian sources that give us a good idea of just what the Flamingo is capable of. We've already touched on a couple of the missile's features. It's believed that the Flamingo has a 3,000-kilometer range, which amounts to about 1,864 miles. That's long enough to put almost any strategic target inside Russia in range, including the capital city of Moscow. The only places Flamingo can't hit in Russia are in the Far East regions of the country, which aren't especially relevant to the Ukraine war anyway. The missile also has a warhead that weighs over a ton. To offer context as to how much damage such a warhead could cause, we can use the UN Safeguard tool to estimate the size of a Flamingo blast. Assuming a fully stocked warhead and a strike against a target that is 1,500 kilometers away, the Flamingo would explode with enough force to be immediately fatal to anybody within a 24-meter distance. That's around a 78-foot blast zone when it comes to direct human casualties, with those outside of this range still being at risk of massive lung damage and perforated eardrums. Buildings fare even worse. Any houses or non-armored structures within 35 meters, which is about 114 feet, will be completely demolished by a Flamingo blast. Buildings can also be rendered uninhabitable over a distance of over 4 times the house destruction distance. Flamingo packs a heavy punch. Plus, this is a strike conducted against a target that is 1,500 kilometers away. Shorten the distance the Flamingo has to travel, and it can do even more damage, Safeguard's tool reveals. Beyond its range and its destructive capabilities, we also know that Ukraine has blended old technology with new to craft the Flamingo. The Economist offers the details in its October 5th article, where it discusses what the Flamingo's manufacturers, Firepoint, used to make Ukraine's new weapon. To make the FP5, Firepoint uses repurposed Soviet-era turbofan engines, and its carbon fiber fuselage takes just 6 hours to produce, the outlet says. Ukraine, once again, has figured out how to take the old and turn it into something new and lethal. That's a long way from how Russia uses Soviet-era technology. All the Kremlin can think to do with its old weapons is send them into Ukraine to be destroyed. It's gotten to the point that Russia is on the verge of running out of everything that it has by 2026, as you'll discover if you check out our video covering how Russia's war of attrition has come back to bite the Kremlin. There's also the name to think about. Flamingo is hardly the most threatening name for such a powerful missile, but there's a reason why this moniker was chosen. According to the Kyiv Post, a minor manufacturing error in the first batch of the missiles resulted in them coming out pink. That batch was nicknamed the Flamingo, and the name has stuck since then. If you want something more official sounding, The Economist points out that the missile is also known as the FP5. A direct comparison to a Western missile has also been made. The closest Western equivalent to the Flamingo appears to be the US Tomahawk. Ukraine's missile seems to have several advantages over its American counterpart, starting with its cost. A Tomahawk missile can cost up to $2 million, depending on the block being ordered. A Flamingo comes at a quarter of that cost. and it delivers both a longer range and a heavier payload to its target. The trade-off, The Economist says, is that Tomahawk missiles are likely more precise and harder to shoot down than Flamingo missiles. But even then, the Flamingo has a few tricks up its sleeve. We mentioned earlier that the missile can fly as close as 50 meters to the ground, which makes it difficult for air defense radars to pick up. Thanks to its high range, The Economist adds the Flamingo could also change vectors several times en route to a target, which could also be enough to fool or evade air defense systems. Ukraine's new missile, even being roughly equivalent to a US Tomahawk, signals a significant leap in Ukraine's long-range capability, Army Recognition adds in its own article covering the Flamingo's first strike in Russia. Its combination of heavy payload, long reach, and simplified guidance design makes it a weapon optimized for high-impact strategic targets such as industrial plants, ammunition depots, and logistics centers far beyond the front line, Army Recognition says. It also adds the interesting detail that Ukraine may have used the Flamingo to strike targets in Belgorod as well as Crimea. But as with the Crimean strikes, there's no official confirmation from Ukraine. It seems almost certain that the Flamingo is good to go and that Ukraine is using it to conduct multiple strikes. That leads us to ask what comes next now that Ukraine's devastating new missile has entered the battlefield. One man believes the missile could be a game changer. That man is the former director of the CIA, General David Petraeus, who had this to say in October. It's typical Ukrainian ingenuity, where they've taken old Soviet bombs, put those explosives on the nose of a cruise missile they have designed with a jet engine and guidance system, Petraeus said. And that will be a game changer. I think if that can be produced in substantial numbers, that will have an enormous effect on the battlefield in the Russian Federation, and that's very, very important. The part about substantial numbers is key here, as the Flamingo isn't going to be of much use to Ukraine if it can only build a handful of them. As is so often the case, money is going to determine just how impactful the Flamingo can be against Russia. Zelenskyy knows that as well as anybody. On October 6th, Pravda reported that Ukraine's president had dropped even more hints about Ukraine's potential, assuming its Western partners are willing to keep dipping their hands into their pockets. Ukraine's defense industry, which has increased by many times since the Ukraine war began, has the capacity to reach $35 billion in production by 2026, Zelenskyy said. Having capacity and hitting that number are two very different things, which is where help from the West has come into play. Having said that, Ukraine is trying to raise as much money as it can from its own defense industry. In cases where it has a surplus of the weapons it's building, it's able to give its partners something in return for the cash they pump into Ukraine's defense industry. Agreements are already in place to open export-import platforms in Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. The task is to launch these platforms by the end of the year, Zelenskyy said. Those platforms would keep money pouring into Ukraine's coffers, meaning it's no longer solely building to use anymore. That would be huge for Flamingo. Would mean that Ukraine has cash to spend on building more of the missiles that it knows can cause major problems for Russia. Right now, Flamingo production could use a boost. The Kyiv Post notes that Firepoint had a production capacity of 1 missile per day earlier in 2025. However, it had set itself a goal of building 7 Flamingo missiles daily by October. Assuming Firepoint hit that goal, Ukraine would have an annual influx of 2,555 missiles per year at a cost of around $1.27 billion. If more money is coming in, those numbers could be pumped up to the point where Crimea, Russia's oil refineries, and almost any other target that Ukraine chooses could be wiped off the map. Assuming production is achieved at scale, the Flamingo has the potential to be a game changer far beyond the Ukraine war. Army Recognition points that out, suggesting that Flamingo stands apart in Europe. Long-range missiles developed on the continent, which include the Storm Shadow and Germany's Taurus, have shorter ranges, more limited payloads, and come at a higher cost. Like the Tomahawk, these European missiles are likely more precise than the Flamingo. However, that won't be much of an issue if Ukraine gets to the point where it can build Flamingo missiles in bulk. Ukraine's missiles likely won't replace those that European countries are already building. However, it will offer an alternative that allows for different types of strikes while giving Europe a chance to continue funding Ukraine while building its collective stockpiles. Why does precision not matter as much anymore? Because many Western nations are attempting to make a shift towards something that Forbes claimed was an urgent military need back in 2023, affordable mass. The outlet's senior contributor Lauren Thompson discusses the problem the West faces from the American perspective when it comes to sheer volume. America's military is credited with having the world's most advanced weapons, but because such weapons are costly, it's deficient in mass, Thompson says. Some experts believe that the current stock of long-range, precision-guided munitions would run low within weeks after a war with China commenced. The West is looking for a new long-range weapon, combines quick manufacturing with simplified guidance, and the reuse of old components to create affordable mass. The Flamingo fits the bill, meaning there is a clear case for the West practically throwing money at Ukraine to get this missile into mass production. Russia knows all of this. It knows that more Flamingo missiles would mean that Ukraine can not only hit, but absolutely devastate many of the country's most important military and military-adjacent facilities. And if Ukraine's constant strikes on Russian oil refining show us anything, it's that Russia has nowhere near the amount of air defenses it needs to guard some of its most critical domestic assets. Russia can't allow Ukraine to get to the point where the Flamingo is being stockpiled by the thousands. So it's trying to nip Flamingo production in the bud. On September 4th, TVP World reported that Russia had made an attempt to destroy a rumored Flamingo missile production facility as part of an overnight strike against the Ukrainian city of Kalush. The city was subjected to one of Russia's largest drone and missile strikes of the war, TVP World says, with the main target being the Kalush Industrial Hub Park, where Flamingo might have been built. Russia's strike was successful in that it set several of the buildings in that industrial park alight. As for whether Russia managed to hit a Flamingo production facility, we simply don't know. Russia hasn't claimed to have done so, and Ukraine likely wouldn't reveal if it had. Still, this attempted strike proves that Russia knows just how dangerous Flamingo is to its ambitions of subjugating Ukraine. When the Flamingo flies, Russia burns. For years, Kaliningrad has been touted as Russia's secret weapon. Tucked between Poland and Lithuania, the Russian exclave is where a war with NATO would start, many believe. And it would be a threat. Weapons are stored there. Missiles that may be capable of carrying nuclear weapons could be launched from Kaliningrad. The Kremlin wants you to believe that Russia's hold on its exclave is stronger than ever. The Kremlin is lying. Vladimir Putin's grip on Kaliningrad is slipping as the Kremlin is losing control of one of its most important territories, and we only need to look at the rhetoric coming out of Russia right now to see Putin panicking. Of course, Putin would never panic in public himself. Instead, he employs an army of lackeys and mouthpieces to hurl threats, accusations, and lies at anybody who will listen. And one of the strongest voices in that army of sycophants is the man who has been causing a lot of fuss about a supposed war between Russia and NATO, Sergei Lavrov. One of Putin's favorite mouthpieces has made it his stock in trade to claim that NATO is waging war against Russia ever since Putin launched his supposed special military operation in Ukraine. It was only a few months after that initial invasion failed and Western support started pouring into Ukraine that Lavrov started flinging his accusations around. Sky News reported on comments that Lavrov made in May 2022, where he claimed that the collective West had declared a total hybrid war against Russia through its support of Ukraine via sanctions and military aid. We did everything to avoid a direct clash, but now that the challenge has been thrown down, we of course accept it, Lavrov claimed at the time. We are no strangers to sanctions. They were almost always there in one form or another. The message Putin wants to get across through his mouthpiece is twofold. NATO has started a fight. Russia is ready to win that fight. Fast forward to September 2025 and the same old nonsense has been coming out of Lavrov's mouth. This time, Lavrov is claiming that everybody who supports Ukraine has declared war on Russia because the rest of Europe has the outright gall to respond as any continent should respond to Russia's constant acts of aggression. Appearing at the Group of 20 or G20 meeting of foreign ministers at the United Nations or UN in September, Lavrov repeated his claims that the West had provoked a crisis by aiding Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Worse yet, Lavrov suggested that NATO, the European Union, and even the UN itself were engaged in a direct conflict with Russia. It's a false narrative that Russia has been propagating for a while, and it all plays into something that the host of the Russian Dude YouTube channel Artem Dikarev calls a desperate need by Russia for it to constantly play the victim as it battles against NATO. And it's in this desperation that we start to see Lavrov's words are directly linked to the situation in Kaliningrad right now. At the G20, at the UN, at whatever international cocktail party he can sneak into, Lavrov repeats the same Putin conspiracy theory. The West has declared war on Russia, Dikarev says. The poor Kaliningrad exclave is surrounded by monsters and Moscow will deliver a decisive response. Russia is painted as the eternal victim, conveniently ignoring the brutality it's unleashed on Ukraine to claim every attempt Europe makes to defend itself and Ukraine against Russian aggression is somehow the start of a war. The war has long since started. Russia was the country that started it. Russia's need to paint itself as the eternal victim hides the secret that the Kremlin doesn't want anybody to discover. You can see it if you read between the lines of Lavrov's claims and his attempts to intimidate the West into not doing what it is currently doing in response to Russia's actions. Lavrov is sending a message that he doesn't intend to send. not just about the Russian Federation as a whole, but about the Kaliningrad exclave that Russia has long used to project power. Behind the smoke, the chest-pumping and the decisive response talk lies a crumbling reality, Dikarev says. The Kremlin is terrified. What Dikarev sees in Lavrov's words is the ramblings of a paranoid man who knows that the West could take Kaliningrad away from Russia at any time it sees fit. That's why Lavrov's words aren't really intended for NATO or any other perceived Russian enemy, Dikarev suggests. Lavrov, and by extension Putin, aims to use the threats Russia is levying to project power to the Russian people, rather than to the supposed enemies and attackers of the Russian state. And it's an approach that has the potential to work, at least in mainland Russia, where the vast majority of people get most of their information from official Russian news sources. Reporters Without Borders highlights the issue, noting that around 2/3 of Russians get almost all of their news from Russian television. The stations they watch are all state-owned and controlled, meaning the average Russian is fed the specific narrative that the Kremlin wants them to hear. And right now, the words coming out of Lavrov's mouth are designed to deliver the message that NATO and the European Union, or EU, are threats and Russia needs to prepare. Plenty in Russia have internet connections, of course. The country's internet connection rate is very high, Reporters Without Borders points out. But even that isn't often enough to break through the Kremlin's propaganda push. The Center for Data and Research, or CDR, highlights that fact in a March 2025 report. It says that independent media can still operate inside Russia despite state censorship. Most of that media has to rely on the internet to get that message out, and that's where the problem lies. Telegram is often the platform of choice, but 44% of Russians who responded to a CDR survey said that they purposefully only follow pro-government channels on the social media site. By contrast, only 14% follow what CDR calls oppositional channels, suggesting that the average Russian is not only being led down the garden path with a false narrative, but they're willing to hold the Kremlin's hand as they walk that path. Russia's problem, especially when it comes to Kaliningrad, is that a narrative that may work on what some might call the willfully ignorant Russian public is nowhere near as effective as intimidating those who really matter to Russia. The Russian elite realized it's near impossible to make smart people believe their lies, Dikarev says, so they focused on those who will. It's aimed at Russians themselves. Lavrov needs to convince the population that's starving through sanctions, losing sons on the battlefield, and seeing the economy bleed out that all of these things are necessary sacrifices because NATO is coming. Lavrov and the Kremlin need the average Russian to believe that message, and while the propaganda may work on the mainland, Kaliningrad is a different kettle of fish. Russia may find it a lot harder to convince the people living in that tiny exclave that NATO and the EU are the enemies that the Kremlin wants to position them as. And it's this very barrier to convincing Kaliningrad's people that could lead to Putin losing control over the entire exclave. We'll come back to that point later in the video. For now, let's hone in on the Kaliningrad problem that Russia has. The Kremlin sees this problem as stretching almost Europe-wide, with Russia's main bone of contention being NATO's expansion across the continent during the last few decades. Of course, Russia's claims that NATO expands to threaten Russia aren't true, as Dikarev points out. NATO didn't expand because Brussels was itching to poke the bear, he says. It expanded because every neighbor of Russia looked at Moscow's track record and said, nope, not trusting them. Russia does have a semblance of a point in that NATO is indeed expanding. The ND International Security Center highlights this in its tracking of the addition of NATO members over time. When Putin came to power, NATO only had 19 members. Since 2000, it has added around a dozen more. Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia are among those new members. However, the ones that really sting Russia are the states that are both close to the Russian mainland and could present a threat to Kaliningrad. The three Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania all joined NATO in 2004. Finland and Sweden, which had long held themselves to be somewhat neutral countries, joined in 2023 and 24 respectively, both as responses to the Russian aggression seen in Ukraine. So yes, there has been NATO expansion. What Lavrov wants to hide is that Russia brought all of this on itself with its actions in Europe over the last few decades, the invasion of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, and most recently the invasion of Ukraine. Those are the reasons why NATO has grown and may continue to grow in the future, to the point where it represents a major threat to Russia and Kaliningrad. Russia's actions could be the cause of Kaliningrad's demise, and Putin knows it. That's why he's sending Lavrov out to refute every claim that NATO and the EU make about Russia committing acts of aggression against those two organizations. And in typical Lavrov fashion, every rebuke is also accompanied by a threat. The Putin mouthpiece is now claiming that the EU in particular is openly planning to launch an attack on Kaliningrad, which is another action that will be met with Russia's so-called decisive responses. The militarization of the island of Bornholm has come under fire by Lavrov, as he claims that it's all part of the EU and NATO strategy to assert more control over the Baltic region. Bear in mind that practically every state in the Baltic is part of NATO, with Kaliningrad being the only scrap of territory that Russia controls in the region. Again, it's all messaging that ignores the fact that such build-ups, along with the NATO expansion itself, are only happening because of the scale of the threat that Russia and Kaliningrad pose to the rest of Europe. This isn't the EU or NATO getting ready to invade. It's these organizations preparing to rip Kaliningrad out of Russia's control if Putin ever gets brave enough to fully declare the Europe-wide war that Russia's actions suggest that he wants. NATO and the EU aren't being aggressive, they're being smart. Kaliningrad, thanks to Russia's actions, is now in a very vulnerable position. Kaliningrad is surrounded, Dikharov says. It's isolated, and in modern warfare, its military bases could be flattened before Moscow even knows what happened. So there is a grain of truth to the Kremlin propaganda in the sense that NATO and the EU represent a very clear threat to Kaliningrad. It's just not the type of threat Lavrov wants people to believe it is. There will be no invasion of the Russian exclave unless Russia gives NATO a reason to launch that invasion. For now, NATO and the EU seem happy to let Russia stew in the mess that it's made, all while taking actions around Kaliningrad that terrify the Kremlin and further isolate Russia from its exclave. We've already touched on the militarization of islands. There's also the buildup of stronger border defenses in Poland and the Baltic states to consider. Plus, Russia may soon face a future where it struggles to even power Kaliningrad. As Euractiv reports, the Baltic region is in the process of divorcing itself from the Russian power grid. While that will hurt Russia in the sense that less energy revenue enters Putin's war chest, it also causes problems for Kaliningrad. The exclave relies on the Baltic portion of the Russian grid to get its power. When the Baltic nations switch off from Russia's power grid, they'll take Kaliningrad with it. The Baltic states have alternatives. Kaliningrad doesn't. Every word out of Lavrov's mouth screams vulnerability rather than power projection. At this point, everything Russia is saying about the NATO threat to Kaliningrad is less about a potential invasion, as Lavrov constantly claims, and more about the shot to Russia's pride that Putin's eroding grip on the exclave has caused. That's why NATO threats sting so much, because they cut into Russia's fragile pride, Dikharov notes. It's not just about strategy, it's about humiliation. If Kaliningrad is vulnerable, Russia itself, and more importantly Putin, look vulnerable. That's the key. NATO's rhetoric is Putin's greatest fear. Take the comments made by US Army Europe and Africa Commander Chris Donahue back in July as an example. As tensions continue to ramp up between NATO and Russia, Donahue said that NATO has the ability to capture Kaliningrad in a time frame that is unheard of, if it needed to do so. Those words would have stung the Kremlin so much because they're not like Russia's attempts to threaten and intimidate. Putin knows that his threats carry very little weight outside of Russia itself. He also knows that when a prominent NATO commander says that NATO could take Kaliningrad without trying, it's not just an empty threat, it's a statement of fact that reveals just how tenuous Russia's hold is on the exclave. It's all paranoia seeping out of Putin. And there's no greater monument to the Kremlin's fear that it could lose Kaliningrad than a giant radar installation that Russia is currently building in the exclave. News first broke of this installation in mid-August, when reports started emerging about satellite images suggesting the construction of a massive circular disposed antenna array. Located just 25 kilometers from Kaliningrad's border with Poland, that radar array was supposed to communicate the message that Russia has eyes on NATO. We covered the array in plenty of depth in an August video, so check it out if you want to learn more about how Russia intends to use the new structure. The array is yet another attempt by Russia to project strength via Kaliningrad. All it really achieves is further highlighting of Russia's insecurity. To the Russian media, it's proof of strength, Dikharov proclaims. To Lavrov, it's a warning. We can see everything, we can neutralize all threats. But to NATO, it's a flashing neon sign of insecurity. And NATO's reaction to the radar array was the exact opposite of what Russia expected. The enemy was supposed to panic. It was supposed to beg Russia not to build this array. Instead, NATO is letting Russia throw millions, perhaps even billions of dollars at a boondoggle that seems more in keeping with the Soviet era. Poland and the Baltic states, with the help of NATO, will keep bolstering their defenses. Russia's giant eye on the Baltic would face the same fate as the rest of Kaliningrad if a war broke out. So it's not threatening to NATO. Weakness is all that Russia has managed to project via Kaliningrad ever since Putin invaded Ukraine. A radar array, no matter how massive it may be, isn't going to stop NATO's modern weapons from devastating Kaliningrad should the time come for them to do so. Putin himself has claimed on so many occasions that he isn't interested in engaging the West in an arms race. He was saying as much in 2018 following another landslide presidential win, and he's been saying it throughout the Ukraine war. Building a massive radar array would seem to run counter to that claim, Dikharov points out. It does, but the likely uselessness of that array as a tool to defend Kaliningrad suggests that Putin doesn't see it as a weapon. He sees it as a symbol a way to show NATO and the people living in Kaliningrad that Russia is still a player on the global stage, Dikarev says. And that brings us back to a point we raised earlier in the video about how it may end up being the people living in Kaliningrad who ultimately determine the exclave's fate. The real dirty little secret that hides behind Lavrov's threats and Russia's NATO fears isn't necessarily militaristic. Russia's insecurity over Kaliningrad rests in the fact that some of the exclave's people don't see themselves as Russian citizens, at least not in the same sense as those living in the motherland. How could they? Kaliningrad is isolated. Russia uses it as a pawn in the games it plays against Europe, often paying little attention to what the territory's people actually want. Russia's propaganda tends to hide the fact that people living in Kaliningrad are far more connected to their European neighbors than anybody in Russia itself. Kaliningrad isn't Moscow, Dikarev says. It isn't Siberia, it's a region that breathes Europe. Its people cross into Poland and Lithuania for shopping, study and work, at least the ones who still can. Kaliningrad has more in common with its European neighbors than the country trying to maintain its grip on the exclave. And for many in the exclave, integration into Europe is a far more desirable option than continued use by Russia as a means to project power. It's difficult to prove that fact. Russia's suppression of information out of the exclave ensures that. However, one unofficial referendum conducted in 2023 shows that Kaliningrad likely has a silent or perhaps silenced majority that would love nothing more than for Russia to lose its grip. The Human Security Center reported on this referendum in July 2023, noting that it was unofficial and carried out online because such votes are deemed illegal by Russia. Residents were asked the simple question of whether they wanted to remain under Russian control or see Kaliningrad achieve independence. No territory that Russia controls can vote on whether it wants Russia to maintain that control, but the referendum happened anyway. The Human Security Center says that 95,567 people in Kaliningrad took part in that referendum, which is about a fifth of the exclave's population. That's large enough to be considered a suitable sample size, and the outcome of the referendum sent a clear message to Putin. Kaliningrad wants out of the Russian Federation. After 13 days of the online vote being open, 72.1% of the exclave's population that took part said they would rather that Kaliningrad be independent than remain under Russian control. That's a big part of the population that outright rejects Russia's hold over their lives. It's no wonder that the Kremlin is so insecure about Kaliningrad's future. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only fed the discontent that has been looming in Kaliningrad for years. People from the exclave, who refer to themselves as Baltic Russians, held a protest in front of the Russian embassy in Poland when Putin invaded Ukraine. The fact that this protest happened on the territory of a NATO member sends almost as strong a message about the desire for independence from Russia inside Kaliningrad as the protest itself. More tensions are coming to the surface thanks to the impact that Putin's invasion has had on Kaliningrad's people. Life in Kaliningrad has gotten worse, Dikarev says. Sanctions choke trade, tourism collapsed, prices rise while wages stagnate, and every time Lavrov rants about defending Kaliningrad, locals roll their eyes because they know they're the ones paying the price. We come back to the Kremlin propaganda. On the surface, it's all part of what Russia usually does. NATO is attacking, Kaliningrad will be defended. However, the reality is that Russia's insecurity is showing. Putin knows that NATO could topple Kaliningrad anytime it wants to do so. But NATO may not have to. Rather than forcing Russia to relinquish the exclave, NATO may just need to wait for Kaliningrad's people to extract themselves from Putin's once vice-like grip.
After the West collectively put its foot down on Russia with sanctions following Vladimir Putin's Ukraine invasion, Russia's president had to get sneaky. Using ships registered to Russia wouldn't work anymore. They could be tracked and, if necessary, stopped. But what about ships that hide their identities? Those that are difficult to track and have no direct links to Russia? That would work, and that's how the Shadow Fleet came to be. Russia has relied on this fleet, which often sails out of the Baltic Sea, to keep money flowing into its war chest, as it loses billions of dollars to the Ukraine war it started. Now, that's about to end. Putin is in big trouble as Denmark has just cut off Russia's Baltic Sea lifeline. Denmark's solution to the Shadow Fleet problem is brilliant. As TradeWinds reported on October 6, Denmark is planning to use a completely legal method to take Putin's Shadow Fleet vessels out of commission. It won't be sending fighter jets or launching missiles to sink those ships in the Baltic Sea. Instead, it's simply going to step up something that it's been doing all along to a point where Russia's shady ships won't be able to pass any longer. More ship inspections are going to sink the Shadow Fleet. Specifically, TradeWinds says Denmark is going to pour more effort and resources into conducting environmental checks on what it calls the old and worn-out ships at the Skagen Red anchorage. That anchorage is one of the key gateways for vessels passing to and from the Baltic Sea, the outlet says. According to the official port of Skagen website, about 60,000 ships pass north of Denmark and through the anchorage every single year. This is a very active port. Russia has been taking advantage of that fact to sneak its shadow fleet ships through. This isn't going to happen anymore, as Denmark says that it's going to keep a closer eye on the ships that pass through the anchorage than ever before. Increased scrutiny of scrubber water discharge and fuel requirements is on the agenda, Tradewind says. Denmark will also start paying even closer attention to how ships handle waste management, and it'll also improve its scrutiny of scrapping certificates. Basically, all of the signs that a ship could be part of the shadow fleet are now going to be on Denmark's radar. Theoretically, this should mean that many shadow fleet ships, which are often uninsured or otherwise unsuitable for conducting the journeys on which Russia sends them, will be caught and stopped before they can deliver the money-making oil cargoes to their buyers. The logic is very simple. Stopping the ships would mean cutting off the flow of money into Russia. Without money from oil, Russia may drown under the cost of a war that's believed to be costing the country around $1 billion per day. Denmark's Industry and Trade Minister, Morten Bødskov, announced the move by making it crystal clear that Denmark has the shadow fleet in its sights with its improved inspections. We must put an end to Putin's war machine. This also applies to the Russian shadow fleet, Bødskov said. We know from our safety checks at Skagen Red that among these ships there are old and worn out ships sailing around. That is why our authorities are now intensifying the controls so that we look after Denmark and Danish waters. Funds have already been earmarked for the new inspections, which will also see more inspectors board vessels to enable the higher level of scrutiny promised. It's a move that is genius in its simplicity, and here's the reason why. When the West levied sanctions against Russian oil, it put much of Russia's existing fleet of ships out of commission. These ships were generally modern and seaworthy. They had the relevant insurance documents, and they were maintained to be a certain standard to ensure they abided by all international environmental laws. With those ships that are no longer able to sail, Putin resorted to the mass purchase of vessels he could use to form his shadow fleet. That alone was problematic enough. However, a major issue that often goes unreported is that many shadow fleet vessels are actively hazardous from the environmental and safety perspectives. Marine Insight revealed why in an August 2025 article discussing how the shadow fleet has been growing at a rate of about 30 ships per month. Shadow fleet ships are over 15 years old and in poor condition with no proper insurance coverage. They sail under flags of convenience to hide their real ownership and use risky ways to evade being caught or detected, such as turning off AIS and performing dangerous ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, the outlet says. It's the part about the ships being 15 years old or more that's really relevant here. On average, oil tankers have lifespans of around 20 to 25 years, Vox reported in March 2024. That may seem like the shadow fleet ships are well within their sell-by dates. However, the outlet adds that the most reputable tanker operators tend to sell their vessels once they reach the 15-year mark. That's how Putin has been getting his hands on so many ships for the shadow fleet. These are tankers that their past operators no longer want because the maintenance burden is too high and it's more cost-effective to run modern tankers than it is those that are starting to show their age. For Russia, tanker age isn't a problem. As long as a tanker isn't sinking, it can be part of the shadow fleet. While Putin may not care about the age of his shady oil tankers, the rest of Europe does. The older a ship gets, the more likely it starts to causing some serious environmental problems. Components start to degrade. The ship may not meet modern emission standards. And just think about what these tankers are carrying, gallons upon gallons of oil. It only takes one disaster, such as an aging tanker finally giving up the ghost midway through a journey, for a massive oil leak into the Baltic Sea or elsewhere to take place. These types of concerns have been around for a long time. In March 2023, Bloomberg published a piece in which it profiled an oil tanker named Turbo. At 26 years old, that vessel should have been sent to the scrapyard. It hadn't completed a full inspection since 2017, and it wasn't carrying the industry standard insurance for the job it was doing. But Putin was still using it, along with dozens of other ships that should have long since been taken off the water. The same outlet also highlights what was mentioned earlier about how tankers nearing the end of their lifespans become too expensive to maintain. Tankers normally receive inspections, known as special surveys, about every 5 years, Bloomberg says. By the fourth time around, the economics of continuing to trade diminish sharply. The surveys can cost $3 million to $4 million for big tankers, and they will then require an intermediate inspection about 2.5 years later. That's a lot of money to spend on inspections. Most reputable tanker owners replace rather than absorb that cost. Russia is doing neither. The almost inevitable results are already starting to appear. On October 6, TVP World reported that several of Russia's decrepit Shadow Fleet ships are already causing serious environmental problems. The outlet cites a joint report created by Politico and Source Material that says Russia is operating at least 5 blacklisted tankers that have been identified as leaving massive oil slicks behind as they sail the ocean. These slicks don't amount to a catastrophe, however, they show Russia's complete lack of regard for environmental protection and the safety of the crews aboard its shady ships. How long will it be before a Shadow Fleet vessel causes a major spill? Hopefully, it will never happen, but the signs are there that Putin is happy to keep sending out ancient ships until they literally can't sail anymore. The European Union, or EU, has a particular problem with this approach. Under the Fuel EU Maritime Framework, along with the Mediterranean's Emission Control Areas, or ECA, limits are being placed on ship emissions and carbon intensity. The former framework mandates that all ships achieve progressive reductions of their carbon intensity. These reductions will start at 2% in 2025, with the intention being that all ships sailing in EU waters will have achieved a reduction of 80% by 2050. The ECA limits ships' sulfur emissions to 0.1%, which is a standard that already exists in the Baltic and North Seas. The points here are simple. The EU wants to drive carbon emissions down, meaning it has an intense focus on the environmental aspects of shipping oil and cargo over long distances. With its Shadow Fleet, Russia is flat out ignoring frameworks designed to support these environmental policies. And that's where the brilliance of Denmark's inspections come into play. The country can justify the increased scrutiny under these EU and Mediterranean frameworks. Russia is left with no real recourse. If it tries to argue against the checks that Denmark is going to carry out, it essentially admits that the vessels most likely to be stopped belong to the Shadow Fleet. That defeats the purpose. Shadow Fleet ships, by their nature, aren't supposed to have any direct ties to Russia. So, Denmark can stop these old ships from sailing, and Russia can't say a direct word about it for fear of incriminating itself. It's not like Russia has many more options for getting in and out of the Baltic Sea either. As War on the Rocks notes, the Baltic Sea is accessible via a trio of choke points. One of them is the Skagerrak, which is the location of Skagen Red. The other is Kattegat. Both are controlled by NATO nations, with Norway and Sweden adding to the Danish presence. If those two countries follow Denmark's lead, Shadow Fleet ships are severely limited in their options. Even worse for Russia, the outlet says, all east and northbound ships in the Baltic Sea have to pass by Denmark's Bornholm Island. That island is relevant to what Denmark is doing in the Baltic for a different reason. More on that later in the video. Now, these types of obstructions represent the very last thing that Putin wants to be happening in the Baltic Sea, because the Shadow Fleet is absolutely essential to Russia's ability to continue the Ukraine war. That's evident from the sheer amount of money that Russia has invested in these old vessels. Despite the ships that compromise the Shadow Fleet being near or even beyond their intended lifespans, they still cost money. According to Craig Kennedy's Navigating Russia, Putin has plowed $14 billion into buying Shadow Fleet ships since May 2022. This has been great for some unscrupulous European and American ship owners. A sprawling follow the money investigation reports finding they've collectively made at least $6.3 billion out of Putin's desperation. It seems unlikely that the West is going to be able to do anything about the sale of these types of ships at the source. Measures like what Denmark is introducing can at least ensure Russia wastes its money after buying a shady ship. Putin has spent all of this money for a reason. As Jamie Shea of Friends of Europe notes, oil is one of Russia's most profitable exports. Last year, Shea says, referring to 2024, the Kremlin pulled in $16.4 billion from oil sales to finance its war effort in Ukraine. That was 5% more than in 2023. These oil sales allow Moscow to stabilize the ruble, control its budget deficit, and keep its balance of payments in credit so that it has money to pay for its imports. The Shadow Fleet is instrumental to ensuring Russia can balance the books not just for the Ukraine war, but in terms of Russia's entire economy. The UK government adds that its July 2025 sanctions against 135 of the oil tankers that make up the Shadow Fleet are supposed to target a group of vessels responsible for transporting $24 billion of cargo since the beginning of 2024. That amounts to an approximate annual revenue of $16 billion for Russia, which more than justifies the $14 billion Putin has invested into the Shadow Fleet. The EU is also sanctioning ships. About 444 of Russia's Shadow Fleet ships are already blacklisted, with another 120 vessels likely to be added as part of the EU's latest round of sanctions. Barriers against Russia's Shadow Fleet are being put all over the place via sanctions. Now, Denmark is creating a literal barrier, and any shady ship that tries to pass through the Skagen Red is going to be in its crosshairs. Some might argue that this level of scrutiny within the Baltic Sea should have been applied a long time ago. Perhaps they would have a point. It's easy to interpret Denmark's decision to strengthen its inspections as an acknowledgement that it wasn't doing enough to stop Shadow Fleet ships in the past. However, it's possible that Denmark has been pushed into action by a series of recent incidents, indicating that it's not just Ukraine that is being threatened by Russia and its military ambitions. Denmark is on Putin's radar too. Just a few days before Denmark announced its new initiative, Reuters carried out a report on several Russian naval provocations that have occurred in the various straits that Denmark controls. These provocations included Russian warships purposely sailing on collision courses with other ships and the aiming of weapons at Danish naval vessels. Russian ships have also been activating GPS jamming equipment to hinder other vessels. Denmark's Defense Intelligence Service Director, Thomas Arenkiel, revealed all at an October press conference. He revealed that one Russian warship had been anchored in Danish waters for over a week, likely to serve as a constant threatening presence against Denmark and any other vessel that might pass by. We've seen several incidents in the Danish Straits, where Danish Air Force helicopters and naval vessels have been targeted by tracking radars and physically pointed at with weapons from Russian warships, Arenkiel said. He added, Russia is using military means, including in an aggressive way, to put pressure on us without crossing the line into armed conflict in a traditional sense. So, Russia is going to use unconventional means to threaten Denmark. What better response than one that Russia would never have seen coming? Rather than attempting to intimidate Russia right back, Denmark is exercising a right that it's always had to indirectly hurt the Russian military in a way that Putin could never have expected. Diminishing the effectiveness of the Shadow Fleet in any way will weaken Russia's military. That's the entire purpose of sanctions. Now, with its increased ship inspections, Denmark has found a novel way to overcome a uniquely Russian problem. That's not to say that Denmark isn't doing other things to limit Russia's impact and presence in the Baltic Sea. In addition to the unconventional, it has more traditional ways of letting Russia know that it means business. Denmark's stronger inspections are just part of a wider Baltic plan that will see it strike back against Russia in several ways. Getting ready is one of those ways. In September, the Danish defense website reported that Denmark was among 14 nations that took part in a Baltic Sea maritime exercise named Northern Coast. The country sent one of its frigates and all of its mine clearance vessels to take part in an exercise where it trained for tactical maritime warfare in coastal waters. Part of the exercise focused on ensuring free navigation through the Baltic Sea for all vessels that Russia might try to target with its hybrid warfare, which shows Putin that he'll have a lot more to worry about than stringent Shadow Fleet inspections if he tries to push Denmark too far. Back in June, Denmark also announced that it was going to deploy floating Sally drones into the Baltic Sea. These unmanned vessels, which are made by a company based in California, look like sailing boats but are really data collection hubs. They're loaded with sensors, cameras and radars that, when combined with onboard artificial intelligence, allow them to depict a more detailed image of maritime activity than other surveillance methods, such as satellite navigation. These Sally drones might allow Denmark to identify more Shadow Fleet ships, especially those that are involved in the attempted destruction of undersea cables in the Baltic Sea, The Guardian reports. Oh, and remember that island mentioned earlier in the video, the one that all east and northbound ships have to sail by to pass in or out of the Baltic Sea? That scrap of land is called Bornholm Island, and it's going to start serving as much more than a lookout point. On September 8, the Nordic Reporter said that Denmark is building up a military presence on this small island. Dubbed the Bornholm Regiment, this presence is the 10th such unit created as part of the Danish army, and it will contain between 500 and 900 personnel. They'll be equipped with 15 Patria 6x6 armoured personnel vehicles, each of which can hold up to 10 soldiers. This new regiment will also add to the force of around 200 people that Denmark has stationed at Bornholm Island in the past. This may not seem like a huge move on its own, however, Denmark doesn't have a particularly large military. Right now, its military only has around 23,000 active personnel, though Denmark has plans to increase this number to 28,000 by 2033. Sending around 1,000 soldiers to a single island demonstrates that Denmark is taking its Baltic Sea responsibilities extremely seriously. The militarization of Bornholm Island may be minor when taken in isolation, but when combined with everything else that Denmark is doing in the Baltic Sea, it's one more piece of a massive puzzle that involves all of NATO. And Russia can't really do a thing about any of this. Everything that Denmark is doing, from its inspections to its increased Baltic Sea militarization, is being done on Denmark's territory. It has the right to do all of this, and it's working under international and EU frameworks to hinder Russia's shadow fleet. It remains to be seen how effective Denmark's new inspection-based strategy is for dealing with shadow fleet ships. They won't stop Putin's ancient vessels on their own, but the extra pressure is always going to be a problem for Putin, a problem that he isn't going to solve. Instead, Putin is forced to rely on hybrid warfare and indirect attacks against NATO, all of which will only fuel more responses like the ones Denmark is making in the Baltic Sea. Throughout the war in Ukraine, Russia has twisted the truth and fashioned the narrative to paint a false picture of the conflict. Using lies and propaganda, its leading figures like President Vladimir Putin have told the world that Russia is charting a path towards some sort of glorious victory, crushing any and all opposition in its way. But those war lies just imploded, and now the truth is out. Leaked intel from official Russian sources has exposed the brutal truth of the country's catastrophic casualty rate, and the figures are even worse than expected. Of course, it's been evident that the war was going badly for Russia. There are countless official sources and statistics to back this up, like the list of visually verified Russian losses in Ukraine from the open source intelligence collective Oryx, which is frequently updated and details the extraordinary amounts of military equipment Russia has lost so far, like over 4,190 tanks, more than 8,400 armored and infantry fighting vehicles, and around 350 surface-to-air missile systems, to name but a few examples. Russia's shocking number of casualties is also well documented. In June of this year, the British Ministry of Defence was one of several official entities to state that Russia had likely passed the grim milestone of more than 1 million troops either killed or wounded in battle, with estimates suggesting that around a quarter of that figure, 250,000 people, were dead. That makes this the most costly conflict that Russia has been involved in since the Second World War, and 2025 has, by all accounts, been a particularly devastating year. In that same June update, the British MOD stated that Russia had likely suffered 200,000 losses already since the start of the year, with a daily average of 1,250 casualties per day. As the end of 2025 approaches, there's no telling how many more lives have been lost as Russian commanders persist with their reckless and wasteful tactics, throwing soldiers into the meat grinder in the desperate hope that their numerical superiority will eventually pay off. At the same time, a lot of the numbers and statistics reported about the Russia-Ukraine war come from either Western sources, like the British MOD or United States-based researchers, or from Ukraine itself. Russia, meanwhile, tends to keep this sort of data under wraps. It doesn't make any big announcements on its state-backed TV channels about how many of its people have been killed or wounded. It does, however, keep records, and some of those records just leaked. For the first time in the war so far, internal Russian records about military losses in 2025 have become available. The documents were obtained and shared by the Ukrainian project Hochu Zit, which translates to I Want to Live. I Want to Live is an initiative operated by Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, GUR. It's designed to help Russian soldiers who don't want to be involved in the conflict surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces safely. It began back in 2022, several months into the war, and by January 2024, the service had reportedly received over 26,000 phone calls, plus more than 48 million visits to its website. There are no details about how the I Want to Live team was able to obtain these leaked Russian documents, and it's likely they don't wish to share any information about any leakers or moles within the Russian ranks. They did, however, post photos of the documents in question on X for all to see. Those documents show a large spreadsheet-style table with various columns and figures. At the top of the page, the main header explains that the figures below detail overall losses for the Russian military from the period of January 1st to September 1st, 2025. And the various column headers represent different types of losses, including deaths, injuries, soldiers who are missing in action, and soldiers who have been taken captive by the enemy, as well as a section on the right covering equipment losses. I Want to Live posted a lengthy thread detailing everything that could be learned from the table, beginning with the following. For the first time, we are publishing Russian statistics on losses in the Russian armed forces in 2025. We've obtained data on Russian army losses for the first 8 months of 2025, and the numbers are staggering. In 243 days, Russia lost 281,550 men killed, wounded, and missing. Over 280,000 casualties in the span of just 8 months. It's an astonishing figure, and one that tells the true story of how disastrous this war has been from the Russian perspective. Ukraine, of course, has lost countless people too, including innumerable civilians killed in Russia's reckless drone and missile bombardments. But Russia, as the larger invading force with all of its enormous defense spending and vast stocks of tanks, armored vehicles, missiles and more, should never have lost so many people for such small gains. The numbers are shameful for the Kremlin's commanders and demonstrate just how reckless and stubborn they've been in persisting with tactics that treat human lives as nothing but cannon fodder. Time and time again, reports have shown Russian soldiers being essentially thrust into battle along the front lines with inadequate training, bare-bones equipment, and almost no armor or artillery support to assist them. It's no wonder that so many have died and so little land has been captured, yet still the Kremlin refuses to adjust its strategy, simply recruiting more and more men to send to their deaths and replace those that came before them. The second I Want to Live post goes into more detail, explaining exactly how that figure of 281,550 casualties breaks down, while also noting the enormous amount of military equipment Russia has lost as well. 86,744 dead, including 1,583 officers and 8,633 prisoners, 33,966 missing, including 11,427 prisoners, 158,529 wounded, including 6,356 officers and 16,489 prisoners, 2,311 captured. The loss of military equipment amounts to 13,145 units, which are irretrievable, and 48,458 units can be restored. Looking closer at those numbers, deaths account for close to a third of the full quota of casualties. This demonstrates how dangerous and deadly the front lines are for those on both sides, with drones constantly buzzing in the air and artillery fire raining down from above, plus large concentrations of troops on the ground, ready to fire at any enemy forces that enter the sites. Chances of survival are slim to none. It also shows how ineffective Russia is when it comes to evacuating wounded soldiers from the battlefield. Its commanders are either incompetent in this area or simply don't care enough about saving people's lives, as one of the later posts in the I Want to Live thread notes. The casualty ratio is telling. Due to the lack of a proper system for evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, there are only 1.3 wounded soldiers for every one killed. This demonstrates the low survival rate of the wounded, who are usually abandoned without assistance after being wounded. As far as the equipment numbers are concerned, these too show the shocking cost of the Kremlin's war effort. Even though Russian officials seem to believe they can restore the vast majority of damaged tanks, vehicles, and other pieces of equipment, they still admit to more than 13,000 total losses, representing billions upon billions of dollars worth of military hardware. And while the Russian data doesn't go into depth about which specific types of equipment are included in those losses, It's known from open source intelligence analysts that Ukraine has successfully taken out huge number of tanks, artillery systems, radars, air defenses, aircraft, naval vessels, infantry fighting vehicles, and other crucial cogs of the Kremlin war machine, weakening Russia's offensive capabilities one strike at a time. The I Want to Live thread continues, detailing how many losses Russia has suffered per month on average. Average monthly losses are 35,193 people and 7,700 units of equipment, of which 1,643 units are irretrievable. Every day, the Russian army loses an average of 1 battalion, killed or missing, 496 men. Every month, the entire 7th Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces is lost. These numbers further illustrate just how big Russia's losses are, with close to 500 soldiers killed, wounded, or lost in battle on a daily basis. It's an utterly unsustainable figure. For now, Russia has somehow been able to keep on recruiting tens of thousands of new troops per month. It's managed this via various methods, including offering big cash incentives to desperate people who are often struggling to find work and simply want an easy way to support and feed their families, as well as recruiting convicted killers, rapists, and other criminals, sending them straight from their jail cells to the front lines to bolster the Russian ranks. Russia has also exploited migrants, piling pressure on Central Asian communities from countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, often threatening them with deportation or imprisonment unless they agree to enlist. This too was uncovered by the I Want to Live initiative in a grim report published earlier this year, which showed how many of these people, who originally worked as street sweepers and construction workers, were strong-armed into the army and dispatched to their deaths in Ukraine. On top of all of that, earlier this year, lawmakers also introduced a bill that would allow for year-round conscription. This would replace Russia's pre-existing biannual draft system, giving the military the power to call up new troops from the general population more or less whenever it wants. Thanks to all these changes, the Kremlin continues to top up its numbers of active duty personnel, which goes some way to counteracting its massive losses. Indeed, a recent report from Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence revealed that Russia had called up approximately 280,000 new military personnel since the start of 2025, with Vadim Skibitsky, deputy head of the GUR, stating in a September 7 interview with Ukrinform, "According to our data, as of September 1st, 2025, the Kremlin has called up about 280,000 military personnel under contract." That's almost the exact same amount as the total number of casualties in the same period, which shows how effectively Russia has been able to replace people who have been injured, killed, or captured by Ukraine. GUR sources also report that the Kremlin hopes to enlist 343,000 people by the end of the year. It's on track to reach or even exceed that target, so long as it maintains its current recruitment rates, as it's currently gaining around 35,000 new soldiers monthly. As Skibitsky notes, so there are all signs that they will fully fulfill their recruiting plan by the end of the year. But this cannot last forever. Russia doesn't have some sort of infinite supply of able-bodied people who are willing to take up arms and put their lives on the line in Ukraine. Nor does it have an infinite amount of money and resources to keep on funding its expensive recruitment drives and maintaining its increasingly costly war effort. What's more, the cost of every new soldier is rising, as detailed in a recent report by Dr. Janis Kluger on the Russianomics blog. Dr. Kluger is an expert in economic development and trade in Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and has written extensively about the financial side of the Russia-Ukraine war. In a September 5 post, Kluger wrote, "If we only consider regional and federal sign-on bonuses, the average cost to recruit a contract soldier has increased from 1.5 million rubles in January 2025 to approximately 2 million rubles today. By the end of 2025, the cost per soldier will likely rise to 2.5 million rubles." He went on to explain exactly what this means for the Russian economy. At 2 million rubles per soldier, signing 35,000 soldiers would cost 70 billion rubles, 840 billion rubles per year, or 0.4% of GDP. At 2.5 million per soldier, the cost of recruitment would increase to 0.5% of GDP. Of course, this is not the full picture because federal and regional bonuses only account for a portion of recruitment costs and a small percentage of total personnel costs, including soldiers' pay, compensation, and pensions. In other words, it's only going to become more expensive for Russia to recruit new troops to replace the ones it lost the month before, and Russia's economic prospects look incredibly grim at the moment, with multiple economists both outside and within the country predicting a major recession on the horizon, plus a serious labour shortage too. Even Putin has been forced to concede defeat in this sector, pledging to cut defense spending in 2026 slightly below 2025 levels, according to Russia's draft budget, to help his country avoid more economic turmoil. But the facts of the matter are clear to see. Even if Russia's defense budget decreases, it cannot afford to keep this conflict going on for years and years to come, especially not when Ukraine continues to launch such effective, devastating attacks on its infrastructure. Indeed, Ukrainian drone strikes on oil refineries, pipelines and fuel depots are largely responsible for the massive fuel crisis currently spreading far and wide across Russia's regions, with gas stations forced to shut down and long lines of motorists waiting hours on end just to buy a tank full of gas at record high prices. The longer the war goes on, the more expensive it's going to get for Russia, and at some stage, recruitment will inevitably suffer. The Kremlin won't be able to call up enough people to counteract its losses, and slowly but surely, the Russian army will begin to crumble. What's more, one of the most worrying things about this new leaked Russian data is that even with massive recruitment and a much larger force than Ukraine, the Kremlin still isn't able to achieve its targets on the ground. The next I Want to Live post compares the current situation to the Soviet army during World War II. This is comparable to the USSR's losses during the East Prussian offensive, when 126,000 soldiers died, but the Soviets captured northern Poland and all of Prussia, including the Königsberg fortress. Modern Russian generals lost 120,000 men but are unable to capture Pokrovsk. It's a damning statement, but absolutely true. The Russian army has been rightfully feared throughout history because of its size, and especially after what the Soviets accomplished during World War II. The Union famously went on into the post-war period to solidify and strengthen its forces, amassing one of the largest stocks of tanks and armour in the world during the Cold War era, and leading the way in military development and innovation, producing pioneering vehicles like the BMP. So, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, so many military experts and analysts predicted a swift victory for the Kremlin's forces. They had the larger army and far greater numbers of resources after all. But it hasn't panned out that way, in the slightest. While Russia has enjoyed some success here and there, it's spent close to 4 years now fighting in Ukraine and today controls only slightly more territory than it did in March 2023, with gains that remain limited relative to the overall cost of the war. What's more, in key areas like the Pokrovsk sector of Donetsk, as the I Want to Live post notes, Russia has been utterly unable to advance. It's tried for months to capture a single city, amassing a massive force and deploying every tactic in its playbook, from using drones to tanks and even disguising its military members as civilians in order to sneak them into Pokrovsk to disrupt the city from within. Nothing has worked. Even with more than 100,000 troops in the area, Russia still cannot find a way to break through Ukraine's defensive lines. Instead, it aimlessly throws more and more troops and other weapons towards Pokrovsk, suffering one loss after another. The I Want to Live X thread also included some details about specific units and battalions that have seen the biggest losses. The leader in losses is the Center Group of Forces, consisting of the 2nd and 51st Combined Arms Armies. The 2nd OA, under the command of Ramil Ibatulin, and the most meaty units that were part of it, the 27th Motorized Rifle Division, the 15th and 30th Motorized Rifle Brigades, lost 15,310 people irretrievably and 16,260 wounded. The 51st Army, which included the equally notorious meat units, the 1st, 5th, 114th, 132nd, 110th and 9th Motorized Rifle Brigades, managed to inflict 13,000 casualties and 14,201 wounded. The 51st Army suffered the heaviest losses of equipment, 1,642 units. The 1st Tank Army, as part of the West Group of Forces, is suffering no less staggering losses, 9,987 irretrievably lost and 11,411 wounded. Elite Russian units, which the Russian Armed Forces Command is trying to protect, lost 2,272 paratroopers killed and missing and 3,191 wounded. As the numbers show, certain Russian forces have suffered much more heavily than others, and it's likely that morale among the remaining troops is exceptionally low. Having seen so many of their brothers in arms fall in battle, those left behind are forced to ask the question, will I be the next to die? This in turn could lead to more soldiers from these units and forces surrendering, deserting, or doing whatever else they can to escape the conflict with their lives. There have already been reports earlier this year of some Russian soldiers shooting themselves and each other in places like the feet in order to be medically evacuated from the front lines and live to see their families once more. This is only going to become a more popular tactic as the losses continue to mount up and Russian troops get a better understanding of the grim realities of their situation. The X thread from I Want to Live sums up with the following message to the Russian population. Russians need to be mentally prepared for the fact that when the war ends, they may be told the real number of dead, missing and wounded. Since the beginning of the invasion, this number has exceeded 1 million. This is the price of Putin's rule and his support among the Russian people. This is the cold hard truth of this war, and it's something that even Putin can no longer hide from his people. Now, learn more about Russia's staggering losses in our recent video, which looks at how Putin's forces are set to run out of tanks, artillery and manpower in 2026. Alternatively, check out this video to see how Ukraine's forces just launched one of their biggest revenge attacks of the war so far, bombarding sites in Crimea and Russia and leaving the Kremlin with a number of serious fires to put out and yet more costly problems to solve. And finally, be sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can be among the first in the world to find out about the latest major developments from the front lines of Ukraine.